Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 1994 film Highlander, The Final Dimension. Now, Highlander 3, which is also known as Highlander 3 the Sorcerer, which makes a lot more sense than Highlander The Final Dimension. I never understood that title. There's no dimension hopping, there's nothing to do with the dimension, other than the fact that it was released by Dimension Films. But Highlander The Final Dimension, just like Highlander 2, I don't think it's as bad as its reputation might suggest. I actually liked it. I had fun with this one. I actually liked it more than Highlander 2. I felt that it was more of what I was looking for out of an actual sequel to Highlander. And at times, it's a bit too derivative of the first film. And there are some other elements of it that are just not particularly that great. But for what it was, I thought it was a pretty decent follow-up to Highlander. And honestly, I feel that it could legitimately be a solid send-off. If there was no other Highlander films and this was just like the last one, I think it actually left things in a pretty good place, especially for Connor McLeod. It's directed by Andy Morahan, and just like Russell Mulcahy, who directed the first two Highlander films, he was a music video guy. He did a lot of music videos for Guns N' Roses, and I don't think he's as good or as polished as someone like Russell Mulcahy, but I still felt his direction was fine, especially when it comes to the sword fighting sequences or the action set pieces. I felt that those were shot in ways where they were pretty thrilling and put all of the actors in a good position to look formidable and look like they were skilled when it comes to sword play, and it also is a film that has some nice establishing shots and some nice wide shots to showcase the scenery, like the Scotland sequence. And there are some other moments where visually it's kind of interesting when it comes to some of the camera angles and the perspectives and the different type of techniques that Morahan employed for the film. And it has a really sexy sex sequence. Like the sex scene in this is like one of the hottest sex scenes I think I've seen in a long time. And I'm talking about the director's cut because the theatrical version didn't have that. But the director's cut, like that has a steamy sex scene that's that puts a lot of softcore porn films to shame. And it was shot really well and stylish. And there's just a lot of stuff like that in the film that's just shot fairly well and competent. Like, I don't think it's like really technically impressive like Russell Mulcahy, but it's competent. It's decent. It's adequate. For a relatively first time director. I think this was his first film or one of his first movies. It's not really that bad of a job. Now, the screenplay for Highlander: The Final Dimension was written by Paul Ohl, Renee Manzor, and Brad Merman. And in a lot of ways, this is Highlander 3 The Apology. Because Highlander 2 was such a drastic departure from Highlander. It really was. It was the complete opposite of what a lot of Highlander fans were looking for when it comes to a Highlander sequel. And so the writers for this one, they decided to completely ignore Highlander 2 and instead made this a direct follow-up to the first film. It takes place 8 years after the events of the first movie. At least the bulk of the story does. There are some flashbacks early on and throughout, but the bulk of the story takes place 8 years after the events of the first film. And it's back in New York, where Connor returns back to his old stomping grounds in New York City. And he now has to fend off a new foe. A new foe to the audience, but an old foe for him because he dealt with this immortal named Cain hundreds of years ago, but he never really thought that Cain would ever be a problem again because Cain and his group of immortals were trapped by his mentor Nakano when he was killed by Cain. So he didn't think that they would ever escape, but all these years later, they've escaped, and now Cain is trying to find Connor so he can win the prize because the game has begun again. Uh, that's what happens with the rules involving Highlander. Like, oh, you think you've killed the last immortal? Well, it's fine unless there's another one. So there can be only one, but if there's more, then the game starts again. And so now Connor has to defeat Cain in order to regain the prize. And there are a lot of elements of this script that are derivative of the first film. I will be honest, but I don't think that it's just a direct clone of the first movie. You do have a Kurgan clone in the villain in Kane who acts very similar to Kurgan, but there's enough of a twist when it comes to the way that he behaves or the magic abilities that he has that I didn't necessarily feel that it was just literally the same character. But I get what people are talking about when it comes to the similarities between the two. There's a love story yet again, but I felt the love story here was a lot more effective and just a better love story overall and had a different twist on things in terms of incorporating reincarnation and a lost love from Connor's past who is brought back into his life again all these years later, and his love for her is reignited. I like that. I like the stuff involving Alex and Sarah. I felt that that was actually pretty well done in terms of the writing. And there are moments in this that I really love, like this sequence when Connor goes back to Scotland to reforge his broken sword. I felt that that was a really cool scene, and it did a good job really establishing some serious strong bonds between Connor and Alex. And it was just a nice callback, going back to Scotland and then him forging his sword and building the sword back up, and while he's building himself back up to face Kane and win the prize back. It was almost like something out of a Rocky movie. It was a nice montage sequence, and I really liked it. And I like moments with Kane where the script allows this character to just be demented in a gleeful fashion, just be just a total creep, but in such a gleeful and fun way that it's fun to watch. Just like Kurgan, just like Katana. Like it's another one of those fun villain performances. And it's a fun villain in a lot of ways because the script gives this villain a lot of moments where, it can really showcase some fun abilities or have fun line of dialogue or two, but also be an intimidating presence when necessary. I like the shape shifting ability. That's a nice touch where he can change into animals or change into a copy of Alex to trick Connor at some point in the story. I like that There are moments where he showcases his magic abilities in a pretty uh, humorous fashion, like the scene where he's messing with the guys who work on the street corner, and he makes all of the cards into uh, um, one particular card, and then steals this guy's glasses with his magic powers. That was pretty fun. Or the moment where he takes Connor's adopted kid John on a uh, hellish joyride. Which, yeah, I will admit the hellish joyride scene is kind of reminiscent of what Kurgan did with Brenda in the first movie. But still, there's enough different sort of stuff there that I didn't feel it was just straight up just the same scene. But there are some elements that are just copy and pasted from the first movie that I didn't think we needed. We didn't need another police investigation. We didn't need it in the first film. It was incredibly useless and didn't really do that much. So we didn't need it here, that's for damn sure. And thankfully, though, they don't have a lot of focus on the police investigation. It's just there, but it didn't need to be there anyway. So I don't. We could have had more scenes with Kane, just being fun and just gleefully, devilishly, diabolically evil, or you could have had some more stuff involving the character of Alex. There's a lot of things you could do that you didn't necessarily need to have a useless police investigation in its place. There's also another pretty useless scene at a mental institution where Connor is just briefly sent there and then he escapes like really easily. So it's like, okay, what was even the point of that? I guess to have a setup where he can kill one of Kane's men and then get the quickening, but like you could have done that anywhere. It didn't have to be in a mental institution. Um, and I get why some people would think the finale, the location of the final battle was kind of boring, some abandoned steel mill, but I didn't mind it, and I felt like it was it was not really a typical sort of locale for Highlander. So I felt that in Highlander, like it was something that was a little bit different. And they didn't just do the same thing again, like oh they're gonna fight and then fall through the ceiling and then get involved in another battle. Like they didn't just do the same deal all over again, like the fight between Kurgan and Connor in the first movie. I like the bit where Kurgan has both swords and doesn't play fair. I mean, Kane. I get the two mixed up, and you can't blame me because they really are very similar. But like I said, there's enough of a difference between the two that I didn't feel it was exactly the same, but they're similar. But yeah, I like the scene where Kane he has both swords and doesn't play fair. And I even like the bit where Connor cuts him in half and then he uses his magic powers to put himself back together. And I really like the ending of this. I think it is a really nice, sweet send off to Highlander. It really leaves Connor McLeod in a good place. He's got a new love of his life, who in many ways is an old flame of his in Sarah, who's been reincarnated as Alex. And he's got his adopted son, John, with him. So he has a family. And he moves back to Scotland. And the ending actually has Connor provide the end narration instead of Ramirez, like in the first two films. And he even says goodbye to Heather one last time and starts a new life in Scotland after winning the prize again for what he hopes is the final time. Like you could have just ended things there and it would have been perfectly fine. So I think that it's a nice send off. It's a sweet send off to Highlander. It's a nice love letter to the fans in that regard, especially the fans of the first movie. And Yeah, I don't really get the hate. I don't understand why this is so hated. Is it silly at times, like in the opening a sequence with Nakano, and when he gets decapitated and he starts talking to Kane and his men when he's like cursing them? Yeah, it's pretty silly. And there are other moments where you're like, this is pretty over the top. But that's Highlander. Highlander is very campy. Highlander has always been very comic book when it comes to its energy and its mood and the style of storytelling. So I don't really feel that that's something that's completely tonally out of place in Highlander. So even those moments don't really bug me that much. And if you're wanting action, like you get a good amount of action, get a good amount of sword fights and sword play, and it's not necessarily necessary, I guess, because there could be only one, and you're doing a sequel to the first movie, and it kind of undermines some aspects of the first film in terms of, oh well, the final battle of Kurgan really didn't mean that much because there was this other guy the entire time. But that's what they had to do in order to do another sequel. And I feel that even though, for the most part, you could argue that it's not necessary, I think as a fan of Highlander, it was kind of needed because of just how completely out there Highlander 2 was. And it just wasn't a proper follow up. And it did all this stuff with the Planet Zeiss thing, and they're from the past, and then they go to the future, and all this other convoluted shit that just really screwed up the timeline, screwed up the continuity. So Highlander: The Final Dimension puts things back in order. So I think that was something that I think in the long run was definitely worth it. And I think it's got a pretty decent cast. Of course, headlined by Christopher Lambert returning yet again to play Connor McLeod. And I think this is one of his better performances as Connor. I honestly, I feel it's his best performance as Connor. Uh, he still has the same charm and the wise assness about his character, but he's also older now, more mature, and there are a lot of moments where Christopher, I think, really is able to flex his acting muscles a little bit more, especially when it comes to the scenes with him and Sarah that take place in the past, and still just as good, just as effective with the sword, and still pretty badass. I mean, he still gets the job done. I mean, he still kicks a bunch of ass and takes people's heads and wins the prize. Mari Van Peebles, I had fun with him as Kane. Definitely taking a page from Clancy Brown's playbook or his approach to his villain in Highlander, but he still adds enough of his own flavor to it that it didn't feel like it was just the exact same thing all over again, at least not for me personally. And Christopher is the one that wanted Mario because he was a big fan of Mario and loved working with him in Gunman, and so he wanted him to play the villain. And I think it was a good choice. Like, he's got a physical presence, and it was also fun to see Mario Van Peebles play, an over the top bad guy. It was a different sort of bit of casting for him. Um, Deborah Kara Unger, I actually really liked her performance in this. At times, her acting is a bit stilted, but I think it's not necessarily due to her ability as an actress. I think it's more due to the script and how some of the lines that she's given is a bit stiff. Because the scenes involving her in the past are actually pretty good, some pretty decent performances from her. Um, but I think she had some good chemistry with Christopher Lambert, and that sex scene. I mean, it's a it's something else. Like, it really, and she did it all. Like, she bared it all and there was no double. She did it. She put it all out there. Um, Mako as Nakano was fun to see Mako again. Basically, kind of just playing the same role that he did in Conan. If you think about it, like another sorcerer who uses illusion. But it was still fun to see Mako. And there's a few other people like Martin Newfield who plays Lieutenant John Sten, just completely useless character, and a few other actors who play the different uh, members of Kane's group of immortals. But mainly, the main cast is Christopher Lambert, Mari Van Peebles, Deborah Kara Unger, and Gabriel Kakon, who plays John McLeod, the adopted son from Marrakesh. And that kid's okay. He wasn't awful or that bad. And the cinematography by Steven Chivers, like it's okay. The editing by Yves Langolis, I thought was pretty solid for what it was. The score by J. Peter Robinson. There were moments with this score that I thought was actually pretty cool. Kind of reminded me of some of the stuff that Michael Kamen or some other composers like Stuart Copeland did with Highlander 2. But there are other moments where it's just kind of generic sounding. One in particular that really stands out, though, is the clear ripoff of Dr. Feelgood, the instrumental rock score that plays during the finale, the final sword fight between Kane and Connor. Like, it was one of those things you're like, you're not even subtle about this. Like, this is totally just Dr. Feelgood. Surprised they didn't get sued. And speaking of Dr. Feelgood, they almost had Guns N' Roses do the entire soundtrack, and that would have been, I think that would have been cool. But the reason why that didn't happen is because apparently Axl Rose does not like Mario Van Peebles. I don't know what his beef is with Mario, but apparently the beef was strong enough that Axl decided not to be involved with the soundtrack. And I think the film has some decent pacing. Like, I think it's the shortest film out of all of the Highlander movies, other than The Source, which I don't even necessarily count that as a real Highlander film. But out of the ones that feature Connor McLeod, that feature Christopher Lambert, it's the shortest one. And it's a bit slow initially early on, but then it starts to pick up once Kane arrives. And I think that it's pretty fairly entertaining for the most part throughout. The effects, though, I will admit, that's one last thing I want to mention about Highlander: The Final Dimension. Some of the visual effects are not that bad, like some of the magic stuff that Kane does. There's other moments, though, like the quickening visual effects or just some of the miniatures. There's a lot of stuff involving this that looks considerably cheaper and chintzier than what was present in the first film, or even this, and definitely the second movie, which had the biggest budget out of all of them. But it still didn't dramatically affect my enjoyment of the film that much. But yeah, that's just my thoughts on Highlander: The Final Dimension. The last good Highlander film, easily for me, because after this it was just a steep decline in quality. You got Endgame, which it's bad, and then you have The Source, which is even worse. So yeah, those are gonna be fun. But anyway, thanks for watching my thoughts on Highlander: The Final Dimension, and until next time, I'll see you later. See ya.